Hey everybody, welcome back to Townscaper. A few days ago a new update for the game was released which added a bunch of tricks to its arsenal, and I think they're very well worth showing off in this video. And in fact I'm just gonna have a bunch of time lapses throughout this video to show off a couple of different things, but I'm starting off with this, which I think is the most interesting new addition. As you might be able to tell, the grid has kind of changed and you get these areas with perfect round circles and sort of symmetrical shapes, and if you build something in the sky on one of these shapes, you actually get a floating island and you get these little propellers at the bottom of it to keep the whole thing in the air, which is super cool. And that's just the first thing I wanted to try out because I guess it just adds this whole other game mode to it where you're building a real floating island instead of just a little island in the ocean. And as much as I already said in the first video that I made about this game that it reminds me of the art style of Ghibli movies, this just reminds me instantly of Laputa Castle in the Sky, and it's so cool. I really love how you can just build completely different islands this way. You do have to build them on these symmetrical shapes. As soon as you get different corners, they start building supports back to the ground, which I guess it makes sense because you don't really get the option to build flying or on the ground, so you really have to build in some specific places on the grid. But once you do get there, there's so much cool stuff that you can do with this, and I've seen many really cool creations of people just stacking different floating islands of different shapes and sizes. And of course, as always, you can move around the grid to find a spot that you like and see what you can do with that shape. One of the most recognizable shapes, I think, is you'll find these stretches on the grid where you have a perfect line of just a complete square grid, and along this line you'll usually find some spaces that kind of look like a bar of soap. You'll see a few squares kind of in the shape of a bar of soap, and I'll actually get into that later in this video, but I think those are the easiest shapes to find that you can build floating islands on. But once you start moving around the grid a little bit, you'll start recognizing these shapes and it becomes a lot easier to build in the sky and successfully build these floating castles. So that's also what I'm doing here, basically just throwing a disc in the air and then building a sort of Disney inspired castle on top of it. Not too much to it in terms of the kind of colors or variations of buildings that I'm putting down here. It's mostly inspired by the kind of concentric city model, which, by the way, that was my phone ringing. Sorry about that. We're getting rid of that. But yeah, it's mostly inspired by these concentric cities. I know people liked to do those in City Skylines a while ago. I think Conflict Nerd had some really cool videos about that. But yeah, we're doing it on a very small scale here. One thing to keep in mind is that these floating islands will have to be not just symmetrical, but of course the grids are also limited. You don't find infinitely huge circles on the grid, so you can't build these things too big. And I would say that this island I'm building here is actually one of the bigger shapes I found. I don't know if there are bigger shapes out there if you just keep searching, but this is what worked best for me. And yeah, I'm keeping it pretty simple otherwise, just some warm colors and kind of Mediterranean vibe that I'm going for here. I had some sort of platforms below this island before, but I realized that you can only have the little propellers on one floor of a certain flying island, so you kind of have to choose there. Either they would have to be separated, or I just had one floor, and I ended up opting for just one floor and just leave it at that. But then I realized that there were actually some pretty good shapes next to this island as well, and here's where you find that kind of bar of soap shape that I was talking about earlier. If you look on the floor, you get this kind of round-ish rectangular shape, and well, the way that flying islands work is that you just have to find a shape where you don't have any pieces that have an edge or that, you know, completely curve outward. So even though this shape looks like it has some edges, you'll notice that every edge piece is actually one of those small round pieces where you can build a round tower on it. So as long as you just have those grid spaces on the outside of your island, you'll be able to put it in the air and not have any supports pop up. Something to also keep in mind is that as soon as you build out from this, and maybe you build a small peninsula away from this flying island, if it's on the same floor, it'll just stop flying, and if you're building above it, you'll just create a peninsula with supports that go all the way down to the ground. So that does kind of ruin the whole appeal of this. And then I discovered that there was also another space that I could build a flying island on. This one actually has a really great shape with just 6 edges, which is honestly one of the better shapes I've found for flying islands, at least in my opinion. And I noticed it kind of late. I was just looking at the grid thinking if there was any possible place for another flying island, and there we go. So you always have to pick very carefully where you want to build, and definitely if you're looking for a spot to build multiple flying islands together, you do have to look for these kind of places where you can notice a bunch of symmetrical shapes close in one space. Especially because over here the kind of symmetrical grid layout is only very short. You can notice that there's some symmetry radiating out from each of these spaces, but it very quickly starts devolving into a messy random grid again. And I say messy and random, but there's all kinds of complicated algorithms behind that, no doubt, but it's something that you can't build flying islands on. So now that's all built, let's take a quick look at what it looks like in the game, and then I've got some other stuff for you guys. So here we are at the thumbnail of this video, and there's something that I completely forgot to talk about during the time-lapse, but you might have noticed that the lighting in the game is a little bit different, and that's because we can completely change it now. So at the moment it's kind of at golden hour, which I have to say is probably my favorite time of day to play this game. Maybe I could make it a little bit lighter, but yeah, it looks really cool, and I think especially on builds like this it really brings out the warm colors of all of the buildings. But yeah, we can basically now change the time of day and the position of the sun to whatever we want to. And if we pull it down all of the way, we actually get some nighttime mode as well. And all of the lights turn on in buildings, which is super cool. So yeah, I'm a really big fan of these new lighting changes. And especially for taking screenshots, it's really nice because you can basically just put your camera somewhere and then try and figure out what the best position for the sun is to just get just the right picture. But there are still some other things that I want to show off, so let's get back into a quick time lapse and build something else. So yeah, I barely had enough time to talk about this during the first time lapse, so let's just keep going and talk about all of the other stuff that has been added to the game. I already showed some of the lighting effects, but even when you're building, it's a pretty cool thing to add to your build, because building with the different lighting just changes the whole game, and you have to think differently about colors, I suppose. So for this build I decided to just build at night and see how that goes. I do think I just prefer building at daytime or maybe even golden hour, because especially, you know, the use of different colors that might not work very well together, it's difficult to prevent that at night. But at the same time, I think all of the colors in this game are very well chosen and can work together in any kind of situation, so it doesn't matter too much. But yeah, for this island I wanted to try something slightly different and not build one of those concentric tall Disney boys. So I'm just going for a small town with a church in the middle. Kind of standard, kind of predictable. But what you're not noticing is that actually the whole time I'm playing this, I'm trying to carefully select a color scheme with a kind of blue tint, a little bit of red thrown into the mix as well, but I'm definitely leaving most of the colors in the game out. And then as soon as I switch to daytime, we'll see what it looks like, because right now at night you don't really notice any of the colors. I am using red and the lighter beige colors to get a bit of contrast in terms of the buildings, because you can definitely see which buildings are light and which buildings are dark, but the colors just kind of disappear. So for me at this time, it's also completely a surprise to see at the end of the day what this island is really going to look like in daylight. And while I'm just building away, I do want to mention some of the other stuff that has changed in the game, because really the lighting and the flying islands in different grid aren't all of it. You can also take screenshots, which if you paid attention at the start of this video when you could still see the UI on the right side, you probably have noticed that there is a screenshot button now. You can hold down undo and redo to very quickly remove or redo everything. And apparently there have also just been some bug fixes and stuff like this. So the game should altogether work a little bit better. One thing I did notice is that sometimes the camera will be a little bit confused with flying castles to see exactly what height it should focus on. But that aside, I haven't had any issues with the game, with the updates anyway, so that's pretty good. And also, something that for some reason wasn't included in the patch notes, at least not on the community page on Steam, but is pretty noteworthy is the fact that we also have 2 new graphics options now. If you look at the little slider on the right of the UI where you can change the position of the sun and the time of day, below that there's a little circle. Well, it's gone now, but there's a little circle, a square, and a star-like shape. The circle is the basic graphics of the game as you're used to. The square is some kind of downgraded graphics version where you don't have the shadows and dynamic lighting. And then the star is really interesting. It removes all of the textures in the game, so it makes every building white and, well, every detail and even the birds that fly around just completely textureless, but you still have the lighting and the shapes of your builds. So it sounds weird, but those effects can actually allow you to make really cool pictures of your builds and at least look at them in a different light, which I think is really cool and a neat graphical addition to the game as well. Now, to come back to this build, I built this flying island and then I realized that there were 2 bars of soap, if you will, next to the island, and I figured that I might as well build something out of that. So I built one of those islands and then just decided to build another one in a different color scheme. And yeah, that's basically it for this build. Let's just hop into the game and see what it looks like. For a while I was trying to build a bridge here, but I ended up removing that thing. Connecting the islands is still something that's a little bit more tricky to figure out, but it's something you can do, I suppose. But yeah, let's just quickly take a look at it. So this build is a little bit more flat than the other one, at least in terms of the actual buildings. The colors are, I guess, a bit more vibrant. Let me make it kind of a little bit more light. There we go. And yeah, basically we have the red island and the green island and the blue island with some variations. Actually, I guess I should call this the yellow one because it also has yellow, which the others don't have. But yeah, some slight color variations, and I think even with these kind of crazy and not always fitting colors together, it still works and it still looks pretty good. And I think it's also worth showing off the grid space on the bottom here, because it's very easy to find this bar of soap, if you will. I don't know who called it a bar of soap. I found it somewhere, but yeah, it's definitely that kind of shape. And you also notice that we have this big stretch of, well, almost a straight line here. I don't know how much further that continues, but yeah, there you go. It continues pretty far. So if you go out from there, you can find another bar of soap here. And, well, undoubtedly, if the grid were to continue here, you'd find more symmetrical shapes. So sometimes you just have to come across this kind of axis, and you can find lots of usable shapes around that as well. Oh, but look at that though. At night, it just looks so cool. And I really love these little dioramas that you get. Anyway, I'm gonna move on. I'm still not gonna let you guys go because I was addicted to playing Townscaper and just trying out random stuff, and I recorded all of it anyway, so I figured it's gonna be a messy video, but I might as well throw everything into a video and see what I can make of it. And this build, I think, was worth showing off because, well, in the last video I made Venice, and I was really sad about how St. Mark's Bell Tower on the central plaza just looked not very convincing, built on a single grid space. So I figured it's a decently simple building, really, with colors that are all in the game, so it should probably be possible to recreate it in the game at least somewhat believably. And, well, looking at the tower structure itself, I guess that's partly true, because you can definitely build the red section, the lower section of the tower, and then going into the white part at the top pretty convincingly, but I totally forgot that there's no good piece in the game for the roof. So yeah, to be fair, I do think the roof ends up looking a little bit derpy in the end, especially given the fact that it's just some green walls and then still the orange roof on top of that, so it's a kind of strange structure, but it's recognizable, and I think sometimes I have to scale down my expectations a little bit and realize that this game isn't meant for this kind of stuff at all. And the fact that you can achieve this very easily and very quickly without having to, you know, work at the game too much, just by doodling around, it's pretty cool, and it's still pretty fun to build. So I'm very happy with the final results, and let's just check it out for a second. So here's the end result. It's not the best thing I've ever made, but it was pretty fun to build, and I guess it's recognizable, and I made it very quickly, so I can't really be too disappointed. I guess this is a good case study for the term, well, the phrase, yet a trace of the true self exists in the false self, because I guess that's true enough here. Anyway, let's move on. There's one more thing I want to show you guys. And no, I'm still not letting you guys go, because there's one more thing I want to showcase. In the first video of Townscaper, I tried building some skyscrapers, and while I concluded that it's really not meant for that kind of thing, and it usually even makes your game lag a bit too much because those builds are way bigger than the game is intended for. Also, you get these strange details in the roofs and planters and random clothes hanging from wires between the buildings, all of that stuff. It's not really meant for this, but at the same time it's just too much fun to build these things, and I'm a big fan of going against the game's intentions, so screw it, let's just do it. And I figured that given the fact that we now have perfectly round grids and also perfectly square grids as well, which you can definitely find, especially if you look for those lines of perfectly square grids that just go across the map, you can now much better build skyscrapers and maybe just come up with a single skyscraper design and see how that goes. It doesn't have to be too intricate, but it's something worth pointing out. So for this one, for instance, I was trying to go something kind of Petronas Towers inspired, except just one instead of twin towers, kind of postmodern with a big, well, spire on top. And yeah, I think it kind of works. And also it's a good exercise of the new graphic mode where you just completely remove all of the textures, because it helps a little bit with coming up with skyscrapers, because you don't have to deal with the weird colors of the roofs anymore, or with the details like windows on the walls. So yeah, altogether, I think it's still a fun exercise to try and build skyscrapers in the game, and I know I'm not the only person who has done this. I've seen so many great skyscraper builds pop up as well. Just figured that everybody watching this should know that this is a really fun thing that you can do with the game as well, and especially now that we have the new grid types, there are so many options for just doodling about with modernist architecture as well. So let's take a quick look at that, and then I promise the video is over. God, I love that sound. Anyway, here's our rendered final building. Before the windows are in, when I think it actually looks a little bit better, because as soon as all of the windows start appearing, you notice that in reality this thing is just a grotesquely huge castle mess. But now let's turn off the textures again and see what that looks like. I think for kind of modern builds like this, you can actually play with the textureless models and especially see what kind of lighting looks best on it, because you can definitely make things look pretty cool as soon as you just get the right lighting. So that's something fun to play around with, and maybe you can even build some cities from Lord of the Rings with this or something like that. The last thing I want to show is that you also have this sort of simplified option. I haven't seen many people make use of it, and to be fair, I'm actually not sure what to call it. I'm not an expert of these kinds of things, but it's also there, which is good to note, and you can make some, well, simplified lightingless versions of your city with this as well. And I always find it fun to open up my old saves and just go through the new options and see what they look like. Actually, let's just do that for the last part of this video. I swear, this video will never end on my watch. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this and found it a good look into all of the new stuff in Townscaper. And if you have it, or if you're still looking to buy it, I highly recommend checking out all of these new graphic options, because they're just really fun to play with. Like anything in the game, there's not really that much of a point to it, but that's just the fun, therapeutic, doodling aspect of it, I suppose. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video of Townscaper, because I do imagine there are still some updates to come, so whenever anything is getting added or I get a weird random idea, I'm sure we'll find each other here again. Bye guys!